Sarah Martinez had always been known for her quiet strength. At 32, she worked as a physical therapist at the Veterans Rehabilitation Center in downtown San Diego, just a few miles from the sprawling Marine Corps base. Her days were filled with helping wounded warriors regain their mobility, rebuild their confidence, and reclaim their lives after injury. She had chosen this profession not by accident, but because her older brother had served 3 tours in Afghanistan before an IED took his left leg below the knee. The morning of October 15th started like any other. Sarah arrived at the center at 7 in the morning, her usual time, carrying her oversized coffee and wearing her favorite navy blue scrubs. The facility was a converted warehouse that had been transformed into a state-of-the-art rehabilitation center, complete with swimming pools, gymnasiums, and specialized equipment designed specifically for military personnel recovering from combat injuries. As she walked through the main corridor, greeting the night staff who were ending their shifts, Sarah noticed the familiar sounds that had become the soundtrack of her daily life. The rhythmic splashing from the aquatic therapy pool, the steady hum of treadmills and exercise bikes, and the encouraging voices of therapists working with their patients. These sounds represented hope, determination, and the incredible resilience of the human spirit. Her first patient of the day was Corporal James Thompson, a 24-year-old Marine who had lost both legs in a roadside bombing in Iraq. James had been working with Sarah for 6 months, and their sessions had become as much about mental healing as physical rehabilitation. He had a wife and 2 young children waiting for him to come home, and every day he fought to regain his independence so he could be the father and husband he wanted to be. During their session, James was working on transferring from his wheelchair to various surfaces, a skill that would be crucial for his daily life once he returned home. Sarah watched carefully as he maneuvered himself, offering gentle corrections and encouragement. His progress had been remarkable, but she could see the frustration in his eyes when movements that once came naturally now required intense concentration and effort. As they worked together, Sarah found herself thinking about her brother Miguel, who had gone through similar challenges 5 years earlier. She remembered the dark period when he had questioned whether his life was still worth living, whether he could still contribute to his family and society. It was during those difficult months that Sarah had decided to change careers, leaving her job at a private clinic to work specifically with veterans. The rehabilitation center served Marines from the nearby base, as well as veterans from other branches of the military. Many of the patients were young men and women who had volunteered to serve their country and had paid a tremendous price. Sarah had learned to recognize the signs of depression, anxiety, and post-traumatic stress that often accompanied physical injuries. Her role extended far beyond physical therapy. She had become a counselor, cheerleader, and sometimes a lifeline for those who felt they had lost everything. Around midday, as Sarah was updating patient files in her small office, she heard commotion from the main therapy floor. Raised voices, the sound of equipment being moved quickly, and the unmistakable urgency that signaled an emergency. She immediately left her desk and hurried toward the source of the disturbance. What she found stopped her in her tracks. In the center of the main therapy area, Sergeant First Class Marcus Washington lay unconscious on the floor. Marcus was one of the center's most determined patients, a Marine who had suffered severe spinal injuries in a helicopter crash and had been working tirelessly to regain the use of his legs. The other staff members were gathered around him, and Sarah could see that Dr. Patterson, the center's medical director, was already on his knees beside Marcus, checking his vital signs. Dr. Patterson looked up at the gathered staff with concern written across his face. Marcus had suffered what appeared to be a seizure, likely related to his traumatic brain injury from the helicopter accident. His breathing was shallow, and he needed immediate medical attention beyond what the rehabilitation center could provide. An ambulance had been called, but the facility's location in the busy downtown area meant that emergency vehicles often faced significant delays due to traffic congestion. As the medical team worked to stabilize Marcus, Sarah found herself thinking about the layout of the building. The rehabilitation center occupied the 3rd floor of the converted warehouse, and the only way to reach the street level was through a narrow stairwell or a single, small elevator that was notoriously slow and unreliable. The elevator had been out of service twice in the past month, and even when it was working, it moved at a frustratingly slow pace. The paramedics arrived 15 minutes later, but, as they assessed the situation, they delivered troubling news. The building's elevator was indeed out of service, having broken down earlier that morning during routine maintenance. The stairwell was the only option, but it consisted of 170 concrete steps, winding down 3 floors in a tight spiral that would make maneuvering a stretcher extremely difficult and dangerous. Marcus, though unconscious, was a large man, standing 6 feet 4 inches tall and weighing close to 240 pounds. He had been a linebacker on his high school football team before joining the Marines, and, despite his injuries, he had maintained much of his muscular build through intensive physical therapy. The paramedics exchanged worried glances as they considered their options. The senior paramedic, a veteran of many emergency situations, explained the dilemma to Dr. Patterson and the assembled staff. Attempting to carry Marcus down the narrow stairwell on a traditional stretcher would be nearly impossible with the available manpower, and the risk of dropping him or causing additional injuries was extremely high. They needed to find an alternative solution, and they needed to find it quickly. Sarah listened to the discussion with growing alarm. Marcus had become more than just a patient to her. Over the months of working together, she had developed a genuine friendship with him. He had shared stories of his childhood in rural Alabama, his decision to join the Marines after high school, and his dreams of eventually becoming a teacher when his military service was complete. His determination to walk again had inspired not only Sarah but many of the other patients at the center. As the medical team continued to debate their options, Sarah found herself studying the stairwell entrance. She had climbed those stairs countless times over the past 3 years, usually taking them 2 at a time when the elevator was slow or crowded. She knew every turn, every landing, and every potential obstacle. More importantly, she knew that time was running out for Marcus. The paramedics were growing increasingly concerned about Marcus's condition. His blood pressure was dropping, and his breathing had become more labored. Whatever was causing his medical emergency was progressing, and every minute they delayed getting him to the hospital reduced his chances of a full recovery. The senior paramedic made the difficult decision that they would have to attempt to carry him down the stairs, despite the risks involved. As they began to prepare for the dangerous descent, Sarah stepped forward. Her voice was calm but determined as she addressed the group of medical professionals who were frantically trying to figure out the best approach. She had an idea that might seem crazy to others, but she knew it was their best option under the circumstances. Sarah proposed that instead of trying to maneuver a stretcher down the narrow stairwell, they should use a different approach. She suggested that she could carry Marcus herself, using techniques she had learned during her physical therapy training for patient transfers and emergency evacuations. Her suggestion was met with immediate skepticism from the paramedics and concern from her colleagues. Dr. Patterson was the first to voice the obvious concerns. Sarah was 5 feet 6 inches tall and weighed approximately 130 pounds. Marcus outweighed her by more than 100 pounds, and the idea of her carrying him down 170 steps seemed not just difficult, but potentially dangerous for both of them. The paramedics agreed, explaining that even trained emergency personnel would struggle with such a carry under these conditions. But Sarah had been thinking about more than just the physical challenge. She had extensive training in body mechanics and patient handling, and she had developed considerable strength through years of working with patients who needed assistance with mobility. More importantly, she had the advantage of knowing the exact layout of the stairwell, including which steps were uneven, where the handrails were positioned, and which landings offered brief resting opportunities. As the debate continued, Marcus's condition continued to deteriorate. The medical team was running out of time and options. The elevator repair crew had been contacted, but they estimated it would take at least 2 hours to get the system back online. Waiting for additional emergency personnel to arrive and attempt a group carry would add more dangerous delays. Sarah looked around at the faces of her colleagues, many of whom had become like family to her over the years. These were people who had dedicated their lives to helping others, and she could see the frustration and helplessness in their eyes as they struggled to find a solution. She thought about Marcus's wife and children, who were probably at home going about their normal day, unaware that their husband and father was fighting for his life. The decision, when it came, felt both sudden and inevitable. Sarah announced that she was going to carry Marcus down the stairs, with or without official approval. She had calculated the risks, considered the alternatives, and concluded that this was their best chance of getting him the medical attention he desperately needed. The determination in her voice left no room for argument. Dr. Patterson realized that they were out of conventional options. He gave his reluctant approval for Sarah's plan, but insisted that 2 paramedics accompany them down the stairwell to provide assistance if needed. The senior paramedic would go ahead to clear the path and alert the ambulance crew, while his partner would follow behind Sarah to provide support and ensure that if she faltered, Marcus wouldn't fall. As they prepared for the descent, Sarah took a few moments to center herself mentally and physically. She had carried patients before, but never under these circumstances and never for such a distance. She thought about the training she had received in emergency patient evacuation, the techniques for distributing weight efficiently, and the breathing patterns that would help her maintain endurance over the long stairway. The other staff members cleared the stairwell of any obstacles and positioned themselves at various landings to offer assistance if needed. Dr. Patterson made the difficult decision to call Marcus's emergency contact, his wife Jennifer, to inform her that her husband was being transported to the hospital. The phone call was brief but emotional, and Sarah could hear Jennifer's panicked voice even from across the room. With everything prepared, Sarah positioned herself beside Marcus's unconscious form. The paramedics had secured his airway and stabilized his neck, but he would need to be moved carefully to avoid causing additional injuries. Using a technique called the firefighter's carry, which she had practiced but never used in a real emergency, Sarah carefully lifted Marcus onto her shoulders, distributing his weight across her back and using her legs to provide the primary lifting power. The moment she stood up with Marcus's full weight on her shoulders, Sarah felt the enormous challenge that lay ahead. 170 steps stretched below them, and each step would require careful placement, steady breathing, and unwavering determination. As she took her first step toward the stairwell, she whispered a silent prayer and began the most important journey of her career. The first 20 steps were deceptively manageable. Sarah had found her rhythm quickly, using the handrail to steady herself while carefully placing each foot on the concrete steps. Marcus's weight pressed down on her shoulders and back, but her initial adrenaline surge helped mask the true extent of the physical challenge ahead. Behind her, paramedic Rodriguez followed closely, ready to assist if she stumbled or needed to rest. The stairwell was dimly lit, with only small windows at each landing providing natural light. The walls were painted an institutional beige color that had seen better days, and the sound of their footsteps echoed off the concrete surfaces. Sarah focused on maintaining a steady breathing pattern, inhaling through her nose and exhaling through her mouth, just as she had taught countless patients during their rehabilitation exercises. By step 30, Sarah began to feel the burn in her quadriceps and calves. Marcus's unconscious body was completely limp, making him feel heavier than his actual weight as there was no muscle tension to help support his own mass. Sarah adjusted her grip slightly, ensuring that his weight remained balanced across her shoulders and that his airway stayed clear. The paramedic behind her offered encouragement, reminding her to take her time and maintain her form. The first landing provided a brief respite. Sarah paused for just a moment, not to rest but to reassess Marcus's condition with the paramedic. His breathing remained steady but shallow, and his color was concerning. The urgency of getting him to advanced medical care became even more apparent. Sarah took 3 deep breaths, rolled her shoulders to redistribute the weight, and continued down the next flight of stairs. The second flight proved more challenging than the first. The stairs here were slightly narrower, and Sarah had to be more careful about her foot placement. Each step required deliberate thought and precise movement. She could feel sweat beginning to form on her forehead, despite the cool temperature in the stairwell. Her breathing became slightly more labored, but she maintained her steady pace. Around step 50, Sarah began to understand the true magnitude of the task she had undertaken. Her legs were already feeling fatigued, and she still had more than 2/3 of the journey ahead of her. The weight of Marcus's body seemed to increase with each step, as her muscles began to tire and her form became more difficult to maintain. But when she thought about quitting or asking for help, she pictured Marcus's wife Jennifer and his 2 young children, and found the strength to continue. The third landing brought unexpected company. Several staff members from the rehabilitation center had rushed down the main elevator in the adjacent building and were now positioned in the stairwell to offer assistance. Dr. Patterson was among them, and he could see the strain beginning to show on Sarah's face. He offered to arrange for someone else to take over the carry, but Sarah politely declined. She had started this journey, and she was determined to finish it. Between steps 60 and 70, Sarah hit what marathon runners call the wall. Her legs felt like lead, her shoulders were screaming in protest, and her breathing had become noticeably heavier. This was the point where mental toughness would matter more than physical strength. She began to break the remaining journey into smaller, more manageable segments, focusing not on the total number of steps remaining but on reaching the next landing. The fourth landing provided another brief assessment opportunity. Paramedic Rodriguez checked Marcus's vital signs again and reported that while his condition remained serious, it appeared stable. This news gave Sarah a psychological boost that translated into renewed physical energy. She realized that her careful handling during the descent was likely preventing additional complications that could have arisen from a rougher transport method. By step 80, word of Sarah's heroic effort had somehow spread beyond the rehabilitation center. Staff members from other floors of the building complex had gathered at various landings to witness her progress and offer encouragement. Among them was Janet Morrison, a nurse who had served 2 tours in Iraq before becoming a civilian medical professional. Janet understood the brotherhood that existed among those who served, and she could see that Sarah was carrying more than just Marcus's physical weight. The 5th flight of stairs presented a new challenge. These steps were older and more worn, with several having small chips or uneven surfaces that required extra caution. Sarah's legs were trembling slightly now, and she had to grip the handrail more firmly to maintain her balance. Each step required tremendous focus, as a single misstep could result in a catastrophic fall for both of them. Around step 100, Sarah's breathing became labored enough that she had to pause briefly at the landing. Not to rest, but to ensure she could maintain the controlled breathing pattern necessary to keep going. During this moment, Dr. Patterson approached her again, his concern evident on his face. He could see that she was pushing her body to its absolute limits, and he worried about her well-being as much as Marcus's. But Sarah had entered what athletes sometimes call the zone. Despite her physical exhaustion, her mind had achieved a state of complete focus. Each step became a meditation, each breath a prayer. She thought about all the Marines she had worked with over the years, young men and women who had pushed through pain and exhaustion to achieve goals that seemed impossible. If they could overcome their challenges, she could overcome hers. The 6th landing brought an unexpected sight. Word of the emergency had reached the Marine base, and several off-duty Marines had arrived at the building to see if they could help. They stood respectfully aside as Sarah continued her descent, but their presence served as a powerful reminder of the military community's commitment to never leave a fellow service member behind. Between steps 110 and 120, Sarah's form began to deteriorate noticeably. Her steps became less sure, and she had to rely more heavily on the handrail for stability. The paramedic behind her moved closer, ready to catch both of them if she faltered. But Sarah's determination never wavered. She adjusted her grip on Marcus, found a slightly different carrying position that distributed his weight more effectively, and pressed on. The 7th flight was the longest yet, with 25 steps between landings. Sarah's legs were shaking visibly now, and her face was flushed with exertion. Sweat dripped from her forehead despite the cool air in the stairwell. But her pace, while slower than when she started, remained remarkably steady. She had found a rhythm that her body could maintain, even as her muscles screamed for relief. At step 130, Sarah could see the end. The final landing was visible below, and, beyond that, the ground floor exit where the ambulance waited. This visual goal provided a psychological boost that seemed to temporarily override her physical exhaustion. She could hear voices from below, medical personnel preparing to receive Marcus and transport him quickly to the hospital. The 8th and final flight of stairs was both the most difficult and the most inspiring portion of the journey. Sarah's entire body was trembling with fatigue, and each step required an enormous act of will. But, as she descended, she could hear applause beginning to build from the people gathered at the bottom of the stairwell. Doctors, nurses, paramedics, and Marines who had gathered to witness her incredible feat of strength and determination. With 10 steps remaining, Sarah felt her legs beginning to give out. The accumulated fatigue of carrying Marcus's weight down 160 steps was finally overwhelming her physical reserves. But, as she wavered, she felt strong hands supporting her arms. The Marines who had gathered at the bottom of the stairwell had positioned themselves to help her complete the final steps of the journey. The last 5 steps passed in a blur of exhaustion and adrenaline. Sarah's vision was slightly blurred from the physical effort, and her breathing was ragged. But, as she reached the ground floor, she felt an overwhelming sense of accomplishment and relief. She had done what seemed impossible just an hour earlier. She had carried a fellow service member to safety when no one else could. As soon as they reached the bottom of the stairwell, the waiting medical team sprang into action. Marcus was quickly transferred from Sarah's shoulders to a waiting gurney, and the paramedics began the process of loading him into the ambulance. Sarah herself nearly collapsed from exhaustion, but was caught by 2 Marines who helped her to a nearby chair. Dr. Patterson immediately began assessing Sarah's condition, checking her for signs of injury or overexertion. Her pulse was elevated but strong, her breathing was labored but effective, and, while she was clearly exhausted, she appeared to have avoided any serious injury from her incredible physical effort. A nurse brought her water and a cold towel, while the assembled crowd of medical professionals and Marines looked on with obvious admiration. As the ambulance pulled away with Marcus inside, Sarah finally allowed herself to fully comprehend what she had just accomplished. She had carried a 240-pound Marine down 170 concrete steps, through narrow stairwells, while he was unconscious and in critical condition. More importantly, she had potentially saved his life by ensuring he received medical attention without the delays that any other transport method would have required. The immediate aftermath was somewhat chaotic, as news of Sarah's heroic effort began to spread beyond the building. Local news stations received word of the story, and, within hours, her actions were being reported across the San Diego area. But Sarah herself was focused only on one thing: getting updates on Marcus's condition and ensuring that he received the best possible medical care. As the crowd in the lobby began to disperse, Sarah found herself surrounded by Marines who wanted to personally thank her for what she had done. These were men and women who understood sacrifice, courage, and the meaning of leaving no one behind. They saw in Sarah's actions the very best of the values they had sworn to uphold, and their respect for her was evident in every word they spoke. The physical aftermath of her extraordinary effort would last for several days. Sarah's legs, shoulders, and back would ache for nearly a week, reminders of the incredible strain she had placed on her body. But the emotional impact of what she had accomplished would last much longer, not just for her, but for everyone who witnessed her heroic actions that day. News of Sarah's heroic actions spread through the Marine base like wildfire. Within 2 hours of Marcus being transported to the hospital, every unit on base had heard the story of the civilian physical therapist who had carried an injured Marine down 170 steps to save his life. The tale grew slightly with each telling, but the core facts remained unchanged. When conventional rescue methods failed, one woman had stepped forward to do the impossible. Captain Michael Rodriguez, the commanding officer of Marcus's unit, was in the middle of a training exercise when his aide approached with the news. Initially skeptical that the story could be accurate, he made several phone calls to verify the details. When Dr. Patterson confirmed the account personally, Captain Rodriguez felt a mixture of gratitude, amazement, and professional respect that he had rarely experienced in his 15-year military career. The Marine Corps had always prided itself on the principle that no Marine is left behind, regardless of the circumstances. This ethos was drilled into every recruit from the first day of boot camp and reinforced throughout their military service. To see a civilian embody this principle so completely, at great personal risk, struck a chord that resonated throughout the entire base community. Meanwhile, at Regional Medical Center, Marcus was undergoing emergency surgery to address complications from his traumatic brain injury. The neurological team worked for 6 hours to relieve pressure on his brain and stabilize his condition. Dr. Elizabeth Chen, the lead neurosurgeon, later told the family that the rapid transport to the hospital had likely prevented permanent brain damage that could have occurred if treatment had been delayed even 30 minutes longer. Sarah spent the evening in her small apartment, still processing what had happened. Her body ached in ways she had never experienced, and she found herself unable to sit comfortably due to the strain on her back muscles. But the physical discomfort was overshadowed by her concern for Marcus and the flood of phone calls and messages she was receiving from colleagues, friends, and complete strangers who had heard about her actions. The local news stations picked up the story around 8 o'clock that evening. The initial reports were brief, focusing on the basic facts of the rescue and Sarah's background as a veterans rehabilitation specialist. But, as more details emerged and interviews were conducted with witnesses, the story began to capture public attention in ways that surprised everyone involved. By the next morning, Sarah's phone was ringing constantly. National news outlets had picked up the story, and producers from several major television networks were requesting interviews. Social media was buzzing with hashtags like heroic therapist and Marine rescue, as people across the country shared the story and expressed their admiration for Sarah's actions. But the most significant reaction was building at the Marine base itself. Throughout the previous evening and into the early morning hours, Marines from every unit had been discussing Sarah's heroic actions. Many had served in combat zones where they had witnessed or experienced their own acts of extraordinary courage, but they recognized something special in what Sarah had done. Sergeant Major Williams, the senior enlisted Marine on the base, approached Captain Rodriguez early that morning with an unusual request. The Marines wanted to do something to honor Sarah's actions, something that would demonstrate their appreciation for what she had done for one of their own. The conversation that followed would lead to one of the most spontaneous and moving tributes in the base's history. As word spread about the planned tribute, Marines from other units began asking if they could participate. Within hours, what had started as a small gesture from Marcus's immediate unit had grown into a base-wide demonstration of respect and gratitude. Marines who were off duty volunteered to come in, and those who were scheduled for training exercises asked to modify their plans to participate in the tribute. The base's public affairs office was initially concerned about the logistics and potential security implications of such a large gathering. But when Colonel Sarah Henderson, the base commander, learned about the Marines' desire to honor Sarah, she not only approved the tribute but ordered that it receive full official support. She understood that this was more than just a thank you gesture, it was an affirmation of values that defined the Marine Corps. By mid-morning, the Rehabilitation Center was receiving calls from the Marine base asking about Sarah's schedule and when she would next be at work. Dr. Patterson, who was fielding most of these calls, was amazed by the level of interest and respect the Marines were showing. Many of the callers were senior officers and non-commissioned officers who wanted to personally thank Sarah for her actions. Sarah herself was reluctant to accept the attention and praise. When Dr. Patterson told her about the planned tribute, she initially tried to decline, insisting that she had simply done what anyone in her position would have done. But Dr. Patterson gently reminded her that what she had done was extraordinary, and that allowing the Marines to express their gratitude was important for them as well as for her. The news about Marcus's condition provided additional motivation for the growing tribute. Dr. Chen called the Rehabilitation Center around noon to report that Marcus had successfully come through surgery and was showing positive signs of recovery. While he would face a long rehabilitation period, the quick medical intervention had prevented the worst-case scenarios that the medical team had feared. As Sarah prepared to go to work the following morning, she had no idea of the scale of the tribute that was being organized in her honor. The Marines had worked through the night to coordinate their efforts, reaching out to units across the base and even contacting retired Marines in the local area who wanted to participate. The response had exceeded everyone's expectations. The Rehabilitation Center's parking lot, which normally accommodated the staff and patients with relative ease, was insufficient for the number of people who began arriving early that morning. Marines in dress blue uniforms, combat utilities, and civilian clothes converged on the building complex from all directions. The local police, who had been notified about the tribute, helped direct traffic and ensure that the gathering remained orderly. Inside the Rehabilitation Center, the staff was aware that something significant was planned, but they underestimated the scope of what was developing outside. Dr. Patterson had received several calls from base officials asking about logistics and timing, but the Marines had been deliberately vague about the details, wanting to maintain an element of surprise. Sarah arrived at work at her usual time, 7 in the morning, entering through the employee entrance at the back of the building to avoid the growing crowd she had noticed in the main parking area. She assumed there was some kind of military ceremony or training exercise taking place nearby, and she focused on preparing for her scheduled patient appointments. Her first patient of the day was Corporal Thompson, the young Marine who had been working on transfer techniques. When he arrived for his appointment, he was grinning widely and seemed unusually excited. Sarah asked him about his mood, and he simply said that it was going to be a special day at the center, but refused to elaborate despite her questions. Throughout the morning, Sarah noticed an unusual level of activity in the hallways and common areas of the rehabilitation center. Staff members seemed to be whispering more than usual, and several patients appeared to be suppressing excitement about something. When she asked her colleagues what was happening, they gave evasive answers and changed the subject. Around 10:30, Dr. Patterson approached Sarah and asked if she could step outside for a few minutes. He explained that there were some people who wanted to meet her, and, while he tried to prepare her for what awaited, he realized that no amount of explanation could adequately convey the magnitude of the tribute that had been organized. As they walked toward the main entrance of the building, Sarah could hear voices outside, but she assumed it was a normal gathering of Marines conducting some kind of training or administrative function. When Dr. Patterson opened the front door of the rehabilitation center, Sarah stepped outside expecting to see a small group of people. What she saw instead took her breath away and brought tears to her eyes immediately. Arranged in perfect military formation across the parking lot and extending into the adjacent areas were more than 500 Marines in full dress uniform. They stood at attention in precise rows, their uniforms immaculate, their posture perfect, their faces reflecting a mixture of respect, gratitude, and admiration. At the front of the formation stood Captain Rodriguez, Sergeant Major Williams, and Colonel Henderson. Behind them, the Marines represented every unit on the base, from recent recruits to seasoned veterans with multiple combat deployments. Many of them had taken leave time or rearranged their schedules to participate in this unprecedented tribute. As Sarah emerged from the building, Captain Rodriguez called the formation to attention with a crisp command that echoed across the parking lot. 500 Marines snapped to perfect attention simultaneously, creating a sound like thunder that seemed to reverberate through the air. The precision and unity of their movement was breathtaking, a testament to their training and their shared commitment to honor Sarah's heroic actions. Colonel Henderson stepped forward and began to speak, her voice carrying clearly across the assembled formation. She explained that the Marines had gathered to honor Sarah's extraordinary courage and selflessness in saving the life of Sergeant Marcus Washington. She spoke about the Marine Corps values of honor, courage, and commitment, and how Sarah had embodied these values in the most challenging circumstances. The colonel's words were heartfelt and powerful, but they were just the beginning of the tribute. As she concluded her remarks, she gave another command, and 500 Marines raised their right hands in a synchronized salute that lasted for a full minute. The sight of hundreds of warriors, men and women who had served their country with distinction, rendering honors to a civilian who had risked everything to save one of their own, was overwhelming. Sarah found herself unable to speak, tears streaming down her face as she witnessed this extraordinary demonstration of respect and gratitude. She had always believed in the importance of her work with veterans, but she had never imagined that her actions could inspire such a powerful response. The salute seemed to last forever, yet ended far too soon. As the synchronized salute concluded, the formation of Marines remained at perfect attention, but the emotional impact of the moment had transformed the atmosphere completely. What had begun as a formal military tribute had become something much more profound, a genuine expression of gratitude that transcended the boundaries between civilian and military, between individual and community. Colonel Henderson approached Sarah, who was still struggling to process the magnitude of what she was witnessing. The colonel's own eyes were moist with emotion as she extended her hand in friendship and respect. She explained that in her 23 years of military service, she had witnessed many acts of courage and selflessness, but rarely had she seen someone outside the military family demonstrate such complete commitment to the welfare of a service member. Behind the colonel, Captain Rodriguez stepped forward carrying a beautifully crafted plaque that had been hastily but expertly created by the base's woodworking shop during the previous evening. The inscription read, "To Sarah Martinez, Honorary Marine, whose courage and selflessness embody the finest traditions of military service. Semper Fidelis." The Latin phrase, meaning always faithful, is the Marine Corps motto, and bestowing it upon a civilian represented an extraordinary honor. As Sarah accepted the plaque, her voice was barely above a whisper as she tried to express her gratitude for the tribute. She spoke about her deep respect for the military community and her commitment to helping veterans rebuild their lives after service. But, mostly, she emphasized that her actions had been motivated simply by the desire to help a fellow human being in desperate need. The formal ceremony concluded with the Marines rendering one final salute before being dismissed by their commanding officers. But, instead of immediately dispersing, many of the Marines approached Sarah individually to shake her hand and express their personal gratitude. These conversations revealed the deeper meaning of what had occurred. Sergeant Maria Gonzalez, a combat veteran who had served 3 tours in Afghanistan, waited patiently in line to speak with Sarah. When her turn came, she explained that she had been injured by an IED explosion and had spent 8 months recovering at the rehabilitation center. She told Sarah that the therapists and staff at the center had literally saved her life by helping her regain not just physical function, but hope for the future. Staff Sergeant Robert Kim, who had lost his right arm in combat, shared a similar story. He explained that the work Sarah and her colleagues did went far beyond physical rehabilitation. They provided emotional support, encouragement, and the kind of personal attention that helped wounded warriors believe in themselves again. In carrying Marcus down those stairs, Sarah had demonstrated the same commitment to Marines that she showed every day in her professional work. One of the most moving conversations came from a young Marine named Private First Class Jennifer Walsh, who had recently returned from her first deployment. She told Sarah that while she had not been injured in combat, she had struggled with anxiety and depression following her return home. The rehabilitation center had become a place where she could talk openly about her experiences and receive support from people who understood the challenges of military service. As these individual conversations continued, Sarah began to understand that the tribute was about more than just her heroic actions on a single day. It represented the military community's recognition of the vital role that civilian supporters play in caring for veterans and active duty service members. The rehabilitation center where she worked was not just a medical facility, it was a bridge between the military and civilian worlds. Dr. Patterson, who had been observing the interactions between Sarah and the Marines, was struck by the genuine emotional connections being formed. He realized that this spontaneous tribute had created an opportunity to strengthen the relationship between the rehabilitation center and the local military community in ways that could benefit everyone involved. Throughout the afternoon, news crews from local and national television stations arrived to cover the tribute. The story of Sarah's heroic rescue and the Marines' response had captured public attention across the country. Reporters interviewed Marines, staff members from the rehabilitation center, and Sarah herself, creating a narrative that would inspire people far beyond San Diego. One of the most significant interviews was with Marcus Washington himself, who had recovered sufficiently from his surgery to speak briefly with reporters from his hospital bed. Though still weak and facing a long recovery period, Marcus was articulate in his gratitude to Sarah and his amazement at the tribute organized by his fellow Marines. He explained that Sarah's quick thinking and physical courage had not only saved his life but had demonstrated the kind of selfless service that defined the best of both military and civilian communities. The media coverage brought national attention to the important work being done at veterans' rehabilitation centers across the country. Sarah used her newfound platform to advocate for increased support for veterans' healthcare and rehabilitation services, emphasizing that the healing process for wounded warriors required not just medical treatment but comprehensive emotional and social support. In the weeks following the tribute, the rehabilitation center experienced an unprecedented outpouring of community support. Local businesses donated equipment and supplies, volunteer organizations offered their services, and individual citizens contributed both money and time to support the center's mission. The relationship between the center and the Marine base became stronger and more collaborative than ever before. Sarah's story also inspired other healthcare professionals who worked with veterans. Professional associations invited her to speak at conferences and training seminars, where she shared not just the details of Marcus's rescue but her broader philosophy about treating veterans with dignity, respect, and understanding. Her message resonated with audiences across the country. 6 months after the tribute, Sarah received another unexpected honor. The Department of Veterans Affairs presented her with the Secretary's Award for Excellence in Service to Veterans, recognizing both her heroic actions and her ongoing commitment to veterans' rehabilitation. The ceremony was attended by dozens of Marines from the local base, creating another powerful demonstration of the bond that had been forged through her selfless actions. Marcus Washington made a remarkable recovery, eventually returning to limited duty with his unit. The brain injury he had suffered required ongoing medical management, but he was able to resume many of his normal activities. More importantly, his experience had motivated him to become an advocate for improved emergency medical procedures at military facilities, working to ensure that other service members would receive the rapid medical attention they needed in crisis situations. The relationship between Marcus and Sarah evolved into a deep friendship that extended to their families. Marcus's wife Jennifer and their children became regular visitors to the rehabilitation center, volunteering their time and supporting other military families going through similar challenges. The experience had taught them that healing and recovery were community efforts that required the involvement of everyone who cared about veterans' welfare. The wooden staircase where Sarah had carried Marcus down 170 steps became something of a landmark at the rehabilitation center. A small plaque was installed at the top of the stairwell, commemorating not just Sarah's heroic actions but the broader principle that no one should face their challenges alone. The plaque served as a daily reminder to staff and patients that extraordinary circumstances sometimes require extraordinary responses. As time passed, Sarah's story continued to inspire others to acts of service and courage. The rehabilitation center received letters from people across the country who had been motivated by her example to volunteer in their own communities, support veterans organizations, or simply look for opportunities to help others in need. The ripple effects of her single heroic act continued to spread long after the initial event. Sarah herself returned to her normal routine at the rehabilitation center, but with a deeper understanding of the impact that one person's actions could have on an entire community. She continued to work with veterans, helping them rebuild their lives after injury, but she also became more involved in community outreach and education efforts designed to strengthen the bond between military and civilian populations. The tribute organized by 500 Marines became an annual event, held each year on the anniversary of Sarah's heroic rescue of Marcus Washington. The ceremony evolved into a broader celebration of the partnership between the military and civilian communities in supporting veterans' health and welfare. It served as a reminder that heroism comes in many forms and that ordinary people are capable of extraordinary actions when motivated by compassion and courage. Years later, when asked about that day and its aftermath, Sarah always emphasized that she had simply done what felt right in the moment. She never considered herself a hero, preferring to focus attention on the ongoing needs of veterans and the importance of community support for those who had served their country. But, to the Marines who witnessed her carrying their fellow service member down those stairs, and to the countless people inspired by her story, Sarah Martinez would always represent the very best of human nature, the willingness to sacrifice for others without thought of personal cost or recognition. The legacy of that single day extended far beyond the physical rescue of one Marine. It demonstrated that heroism is not limited to battlefields or emergency responders, but can emerge anywhere that people choose to put the welfare of others above their own comfort and safety. In carrying Marcus Washington down 170 concrete steps, Sarah Martinez had not just saved a life, she had reminded an entire community of the power of compassion, courage, and unwavering commitment to helping others in their time of greatest need.